the city or the wilderness, the Church Fathers and the Desert Fathers. Questions from our last discussion. Who was Paul of Tarsus, and why was he so significant to the early Jesus movement? What is an epistle, an apostle, Pentecost, the Council of Jerusalem, and the Second Coming? How did Christianity spread amongst different cultic groups, and what were some of the issues that each group had to deal with? Part 1. Christianization of the world. After the Council of Jerusalem in the year 50, it was agreed on by most Christians that belief in Jesus could be spread to anyone, Judean or pagan. There were some Judean Christians who would fight back against that trend for centuries, but in the end, Christians on the whole would agree that you don't need to follow most of the halakhic laws to follow Christ. You don't need to be circumcised to join the cult. Baptism is enough. You don't have to follow all the particularities of the kosher diet, just so long as you don't eat the meat and blood of pagan sacrifices. From its earliest days, Christianity has been quite similar to the mystery religions found elsewhere in the Roman pagan world. Christians would meet in secret, for instance in people's houses, or speak in coded language in a public setting like a synagogue. Jesus was a mystery, an experience one needed to have for oneself in order to understand. For many, that gave Christianity a certain cryptic glamour, like the mystery religions had. It was appealing to be in on something that was important and profound. But this also sowed seeds of suspicion from the outsiders. What were these Christians up to? Here now were some people, most of whom were pagans, who were suddenly members of an unknown cult. Christianity was new on the scene, so most non-Christians had no idea what to make of it. There were all sorts of odd rumors. People seriously thought that Christians were having bizarre orgiastic rituals in their homes. And when outsiders heard that members of this new cult ate food that they claimed was the body and blood of their founder, rumors of cannibalism spread around too. But most importantly, in public, people could see that Christians were refusing to eat the food sacrificed to the gods. So what non-Christians did know about the Christians for sure was that this Middle Eastern cult was opposed to other local cults. Now, pagans generally were not that concerned that people didn't follow their own local or regional religions. But they were concerned that people weren't following the imperial religion. If you didn't participate in the national cult, that is, by eating the food sacrificed to the emperor's genius, his personal god, then you were declaring yourself an enemy of the empire itself. You were saying you didn't believe in the authority of Rome. Now, some people had been exempted from emperor worship, such as the Judeans. The Romans knew that the Judean religion forbade worshipping other gods, but that prohibition predated the rise of the empire. And the Romans understood that, so Judeans not offering sacrifice to Caesar wasn't an anti-Roman political move, it was just how their cult worked. But the Christians, most of whom were not Judeans, were new. They arose in the Roman world, and so when they chose to disregard the emperor's gods, they knew it was a political affront to Rome itself. And so, in many areas of the Roman world, Christians would be persecuted for their adherence to the Jesus cult. This is why so many early Christians were martyred. Paul was beheaded just outside of Rome. Peter was crucified, upside down. But persecution was handled surprisingly well by many Christians. After all, their movement was literally founded by a man who had been killed by the Romans. Christianity had assumed that not only was dying for one's belief not necessarily a bad thing, it could actually earn you a fast track to salvation. As Jesus' violent death saved everyone from sin, so too could an individual martyr's violent death save her from her own sin. And the early writings about Jesus were explicit about this. Jesus told his disciples, "If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. For what will it profit a man if he gains the whole world and forfeits his soul?" The martyr's death wasn't a failure. It was, like Jesus crucified, a victorious triumph over sin, a surefire way of winning salvation from one's personal wrongdoings. And many Christians took this belief to heart so deeply that they actively sought out their own deaths. They would proclaim their adherence to the Christian cult in public forums, or they would purposely taunt Roman soldiers. This created a feedback loop of martyrdom. The more the Romans killed the Christians, the more successful the Christians would feel their movement was. And the more popular and bold the Christians became because of that, the more the Romans would try to crush them, creating more martyrs. And martyrdom is captivating. While terrible, martyrdom, even for a cause you yourself don't believe in, is very fascinating to people. And people tend to have sympathy with someone willing to die for their beliefs. Plus, martyrdom spoke to the power of the Christian cult. Remember that for most pagans, the power of a certain cult was not about gaining information, but in the experience it gave to you. So an outsider could see members of this obscure cult who clearly had experiences so powerful that they were actively willing to die for them. And on top of that, martyrdom is like advertisement. Seeing someone die for their cult would, if nothing else, make you start wondering about that cult. What cultic experiences are these Christians having in their secret meetings that's so powerful to them? I'll ask around. Multiply this over many thousands of people over the course of centuries, and Christianity spread not in spite of Roman persecution, but because of it. By the beginning of the 4th century, Christianity was not just one more cult amongst many, but the most popular cult in the Roman world. Roman Christians may have already been the majority by this time. Finally, the push and pull of Roman-Christian relations came to a head in the form of the Emperor Constantine. In 313, Constantine passed the Edict of Milan, the official acceptance of Christianity as a recognized Roman cult. It was no longer illegal to be a Christian. And Constantine patronized Christianity and probably converted himself. In 330, he moved the capital of the empire from Italy, which was still quite pagan, to the eastern city of Byzantium, which he named Constantinople after himself. He had his own mother identify historical sites in and around Jerusalem that were somehow connected to the life of Jesus, so now these sites could receive pilgrims. He reached out to many of the churches across the empire and worked to resolve religious disagreements between their various overseers, episkopos, bishops. Christianity had shifted radically from being a persecuted peasant minority movement to being the favored cult of the emperor himself. It was now politically wise to be a Christian. Why wouldn't you want to join up with the emperor's own favorite religion? So the spread of Christianity continued until, in the year 380, a later emperor, Theodosius, declared Christianity the official religion of the empire. Many pagan cults were shut down, the Olympic Games were ended, and any Christian violence against pagan religions was ignored, if not actively promoted. Part 2. Late Antiquity. Rome was a Christian empire, and paganism was getting increasingly marginalized. This is when we start to see the word pagan appear. Remember how pagan implies someone who is backwards, uneducated, and lives somewhere remote, like the English word bumpkin? Well, this is when this line of thinking materializes. In the Roman centers of power and influence, in cities and universities, Christianity was practiced by people in the elite, politicians, philosophers, writers, the wealthy. Anyone who wasn't a Christian was just a bunch of pagani, a bunch of hicks far from the centers of power. The name modern scholars use for the time after the Christianization of Rome, but before the Middle Ages, the medieval period, is late Antiquity. Late Antiquity refers to the time when the Roman world turned to the east. The Roman government moved from the Latin-speaking west to the Greek-speaking east, Constantinople. The Roman religion shifted from the various forms of indigenous paganism to this Middle Eastern Christian religion. And it didn't hurt that the wealthiest and most productive regions of the Roman world were in the Greek-speaking East too. The Latin west of the empire was increasingly less important to the government, less central to the Roman culture, and less significant to the Roman economy. Finally, Roman rule in the Latin west collapsed in 476. The rule of law dissolved, politicians were killed regularly, and barbarians invaded as they wanted to. So, we're going to leave the Latin West until next time and focus on the late antique East, where Rome continued on for many centuries. Making Christianity the official religion of the empire not only transformed that empire, it transformed Christianity. Christianity had previously been a cultic movement. Local churches met in people's houses, and in some corners they were still meeting in synagogues. Christians did have a sense that there was a universal identity that they all shared, but since there was no body or ruler with the ability to speak on behalf of all Christians everywhere, Christians were more or less free to do whatever they wanted. The Christian cult in Alexandria might be quite different than another in Damascus. They would have different languages, different rituals, different heroes and local martyrs, different theologies, different Christologies, different epistles, and different gospels. But once Rome turned Christian, that diversity was a problem. Orthodoxy and orthopraxy were political, not just cultic issues. And if there's only one true ruler, the Roman emperor, there can only be one true Christianity, the emperor's own. There was to be an official form of Christianity, variously referred to as just the right opinion, orthodox, the imperial Christianity, or the Catholicos, or Catholic, meaning universal Christianity. Okay, if you're the emperor and you want to make your religion the official religion, first you have to standardize it. You can't publicly endorse Christianity if everyone disagrees about what Christianity is. So first you ask, who has the right to decide these kinds of things? After the emperor, who's authoritative? Well, after Jesus ascended to heaven, God's Spirit came down to dwell with the apostles at Pentecost. So God spoke through the apostles. The apostles had authority. Therefore, the leaders of the local Christian groups, the bishops, who had inherited their roles from the apostles themselves, presumably they had also inherited God's gift of the Holy Spirit. They were the successors of the apostles from centuries before. Now, the most successful of these people would later be known as the Church Fathers, bishops and scholars whose opinions would in time shape the official Christianity of the empire. But still, the Church Fathers and other bishops disagreed about almost everything other than the fact that Jesus was somehow important. So you couldn't just hope that all the bishops would speak with one voice. That never happened. But as in the case of the Council of Jerusalem, the apostles together could make a decision on behalf of all Christians, even when those apostles were in disagreement. So collectively, the bishops, as the supposed spiritual descendants of the apostles, could resolve their debates collectively in councils. Great, so then what were the teachings of the bishops about the nature of God and the Christian message? What was their consensus on what Christianity was and was supposed to be? To answer that question exactly, Constantine called a council of bishops together in the city of Nicaea in the year 325. They debated a great number of Christian teachings and practices, both major and minor. For instance, when should Easter, the celebration of Jesus' resurrection from the dead, be held? Jesus died just after Passover, but Passover could only be calculated using the Jewish calendar, a lunar calendar. But the Roman imperial calendar was solar, so how to calculate this date for most Romans? The bishops concluded that they could reconcile the Jewish lunar dating system and the Roman one by having Easter celebrated on the first Sunday after the first full moon of the springtime. The most famous argument to come out of Nicaea, though, was over the issue of what exactly the Christian God was. The first Christians identified God in many ways using many titles: God, Father, Spirit, Lord, Jesus, Messiah or Christ, Logos, and many more. Some of these were clearly synonymous. Jesus is the Logos and the Christ. But some clearly were not synonymous. The Father is not Jesus. The Spirit is not the Logos. So, if you reduce down all the names and titles for God found in Christian writings, you're left with 3 clusters of names which all refer to God somehow. There are words that refer to the transcendent power of the cosmos that no one has ever seen, like Father or Creator. And there are words that apply to Jesus, like the Son of God, Christ, and Logos. And there are some words that describe God when he is active within creation, like Spirit or Wisdom. All 3 of these categories are called God and Lord, but they can't be reduced into each other, because you can see in Christian writings that they act in relationships. So, for example, at Jesus' baptism, he received the Spirit in the form of a dove, and then a voice coming from neither Jesus nor the dove called Jesus his Son. So, if Jesus was God, and the Spirit was God, and this fatherly voice was God, and they could interact with each other, that is to say, they had relationships, they couldn't be exactly the same. And they can't be multiple gods, because the Tanakh was quite clear that God was one. And if God is one, God doesn't have parts either. And so Nicaea pushed for a triune or Trinitarian reading of God. The Trinity, meaning something that is threefold, is the name imperial Christianity used for the relationship between the Father, the Son, and the Spirit. The Trinity is how God relates to God's self. It's famously hard to grasp, but try to follow the logic of it. The Nicene interpretation of the Trinity works like this: God is one, eternal, and unchanging. So nothing of God can ever come into existence or get added on. God cannot get bigger or smaller, older or heavier. And because God is one, God has no parts. Nothing about God can be less God than anything else that is God. This is unlike us humans, where, for instance, our toes are less who we are than what our brains are. Our toes are human. Our brains are human. But our brains are more human than our toes. But God is one and has no parts. So anything that is God is fully God and nothing but fully God. While God doesn't have parts the way that we do, God does have substances. One substance is the Father, who's never been seen, according to John's Gospel. And this substance created everything. The first substance creates through the second substance, the Son, who is incarnated in a certain individual named Jesus. And the third substance, the Spirit, is God as present elsewhere in creation, in other people, like the apostles and the bishops, or in nature. The Father sends the Son, but not in any moment in time. He sends him eternally. The Son was with God and was God in the beginning. There was never a time when the Son was not in existence, and there was never a time when the Son was made God, because an eternal God cannot change or be changed. Likewise, the Spirit proceeds from both the Father and the Son to be present with creation. And again, this happens without beginning or end. The Spirit was always God, and always will be God, and always has proceeded from the Father and the Son. Okay, but then why aren't there three gods? God has three substances, true, but that doesn't make God three things. The problem arises because God is transcendent, while we are immanent. For us, when we see three substances, that means we're seeing three distinct real things. But God doesn't work that way at all, because God isn't a thing. There can be multiplicity in God, without there being multiple gods or multiple parts of God. Are you confused? Well, remember that this discussion of Trinity is happening in Greek, and the standard Greek word that the bishops themselves use is mystery. The Trinity is not a puzzle that you're supposed to solve, but it's an experience that you're supposed to participate in your prayers, your rituals, and your meditations. So, if it helps, think of it as a myth. Don't try to reduce it down to something, but think of it as something to be experienced. God, the ultimate reality of things, is hidden from us. But by participating in the Jesus cult, through the guidance of the Spirit, one can come to a deeper awareness of God the Father. Now, don't think for even a second that all Christians affirmed the Council of Nicaea about the Trinity. There were other interpretations of the Trinity, and there were, and are, still many Christian groups who aren't Trinitarians at all. And besides all that, the Nicene interpretation of God as Trinity is logically odd and very hard to grasp. So there were many Christians in the 4th century, as well as today, that claimed to affirm the Trinity, but also found the argument to be too complicated or too academic to be personally meaningful. They may say and believe that they're Trinitarians, because it's the emperor's own official position on the matter. But that also doesn't necessarily mean that most Christians, who were uneducated, illiterate, and busy earning a living, had the time or the ability to think about this very heady theology. Trinity was the official religious opinion, it was orthodoxy, but that doesn't mean that most people themselves understood it or agreed with it. But where the Trinity did make a big difference to Christian day-to-day life was as a hermeneutical key. If the Trinity, as understood by the Church Fathers, and especially the bishops of Nicaea, is true, it could be used as a way of checking on the truth of other Christian beliefs and practices. So the emperor's bishops next asked themselves which texts were in agreement with Trinitarianism. There were already hundreds of Christian books, epistles, and hymns, and they were all in circulation and they all didn't say the same things. Many of these writings were even condemning the teachings of other writings. So, which of these texts was also inspired by God's Spirit, like the bishops themselves were, and therefore did not contradict the Trinity? The books of the Tanakh, the Hebrew anthology of the Torah, the prophetic texts, and the other ancient writings, well, they were authoritative, and none of them were explicitly opposed to the Trinity. But they only foreshadowed Christianity. They were only records of God's former covenant to the Israelites. They were the Old Testament, records of the old promise that God had made with just one people. But what text formed God's new covenant with all people everywhere? what is the New Testament? In the year 382, another council was held in Rome by the Emperor Theodosius to resolve that question. The bishops of the Council of Rome affirmed the Tanakh as evidence of God's Old Testament. And then, likewise, the order of the writings of the New and Eternal Testament, which only the Holy and Catholic Church supports, of the Gospels, one book according to Matthew, one book according to Mark, one book according to Luke, and one book according to John. The epistles of Paul the Apostle, 14 in number. By the end of this decree, they identified 27 different epistles, gospels, and other writings as the official canon of the Universal or Catholic Church, the imperial official Christianity. All other Christian literatures were not necessarily inspired by the teachings of the Spirit, and so they could only be trusted on a case-by-case basis. Only the 23 books of the Tanakh, now the Old Testament, and the 27 of this New Testament were endorsed by the emperors as the official collection of Ta Biblia, the Christian Bible. But again, that does not mean that all other early Christian literatures just disappeared, or that other Christians didn't have other versions of the Bible. Many Christian communities used other books that were not in the emperor's canon, and some Christians had some theological issue or another with the books on that imperial church list. And the fact that the Roman government's new official canon disregarded any book not written in the Roman government's own language, Greek, well, that wouldn't have made non-Greek Christians happy either. So those people who disagreed with the official government, the official church, and its bishops and writings, well, they carried on without imperial endorsement. They were either ignored or debated with, and sometimes they were suppressed as the emperors saw fit. Part 3. The Living Martyrs. Telling the history of Christianity through the eyes of the church fathers and their debates about the Trinity and the books of the Bible can be a little bit misleading. Most Christians weren't bishops arguing Trinitarian logic in the emperor's court. Most Christians couldn't read, much less read in Greek, so the official policies of the Roman government regarding orthodoxy or which books belonged in the Bible didn't really influence their lives in any direct way. Maybe their local bishop agreed with the official state version of Christianity, but maybe he didn't. And maybe the closest bishop lived hundreds of miles away, so it didn't matter what he thought about anything. So, where were the peasants and other commoners getting their Christianity from? Well, not from books, and most certainly not from theological debates. No, they experienced Christianity in the lives of holy people, saints. Now, at this time, a saint just meant any person whose life reflected the truth of Christ. Only later would the imperial church officially endorse certain particular people as saints. Most of the time, though, a saint was just someone who participated in the life of Christ particularly well. It could be someone who had a prophetic or miraculous gift from the Spirit. It could be someone notably intelligent or remarkably moral. John the Baptist and many of Jesus' disciples, like the apostles, would be called saints, and as would many of the church fathers and other bishops. But in the early centuries of Christianity, the overwhelming majority of people, popularly called saints, were the martyrs. They were the witnesses who died in Jesus' name. And they could be anyone, women or men, young or old. They could come from anywhere, speak any language, and belong to any social class. Martyrdom cut across all lines of society and revealed the truth of Jesus in a way that anyone could see and understand. While the teachings of the official church may not influence your average Christian on the ground, the fact that there was an official church did make a difference, though. If Christianity was the religion of the empire, that meant the empire wasn't persecuting Christians anymore. And without persecution, there were no more martyrs. Now, on the surface, of course, that's a good thing. Christians weren't being killed. But then a problem arises. Let's look at this line from Matthew again. How is a Christian supposed to take up their cross if the Romans aren't crucifying people for Jesus' sake? How can you lose your life for Jesus' sake without persecution? What is orthopraxy, right practice, when the martyrdom that so many of the great saints exemplified was now off the table? Well, you become a living martyr. You give up your life for Jesus through radical renunciation. You sell all of your possessions, like the apostles once did. You give up your family and your wealth and the pleasures of food and sex. And you give your body to God in other ways. You won't die from doing these things, but you may try to die to sin. You can encounter Christ through mysticism, extreme acts of devotion and discipline. People who attempted this kind of thing would be known as the Desert Fathers, although don't let the gendered language throw you. There were many famous women who did this too. They would cut ties to the world of society and cities and move out into the wilderness, the desert, and the forests. There were different forms of this new martyrdom. Some Christians, especially in Egypt and Syria, strove to break their ties to worldly things by actively fleeing from society. Society was sinful and corruptive, so the best way to discipline yourself was to live alone, monos, that is, as a monk. You would never marry or have children. You would never inherit any wealth. And you would confine yourself to a cell or a cave in a deliberately remote location to focus on prayer and fasting alone. Many of these monks would live as utter hermits, without any human contact at all, while others lived in small communities, the first Christian monasteries, where the monks could train and help each other along the path to saintliness. Meanwhile, other Christians took the notion of living martyrdom to a radical extreme. They would publicly perform ascetic activities as a way of reenacting the teachings and life of Jesus. They would take vows to never speak again, or live in cemeteries, or on top of specially designed pillars high above the ground that they couldn't come down off of or sit down on top of. Other people would see these Christian monks and ascetics doing extraordinary things, and they would come to understand something more about Jesus' own morality and suffering on the cross. Who needed a book that you couldn't read anyway to tell you about Jesus, when there was a living saint just over the hill whose very life demonstrated Christianity directly to you? A saint could offer you personal advice and counsel on how to live according to God's will. A saint can speak to you firsthand, in a way that a book or some faraway bishop in the emperor's court never could. Many of these saints would themselves become objects of cultic adoration. If God listened to the prayers of righteous people, perhaps you could ask a righteous person to pray on your behalf. And even if a saint was dead, a person who lived in accord with Christ so well must certainly be in Christ's presence now. Maybe she can intercede with Christ on your behalf and give him the kind of self-effacing devotion few others, including yourself, have capacity for. Some questions to ask before you get to class. What historical forces led to the Christianization of the Roman world? What are the pre-modern meanings of the words bishop, Catholic, the Council of Nicaea, Trinity, the New Testament, and saint? What kinds of new Christian orthodoxy and orthopraxy appeared in late antiquity?